Somewhere in the back of an archive, behind boxes nobody had touched in decades, beneath folders of forgotten tax filings and water-stained correspondence, there was a ledger, small, unremarkable, bound in cloth the color of dried blood. It had been passed around the family like an old embarrassment. Nobody wanted it. Nobody understood it. And for the better part of 40 years, it sat in cardboard boxes, moved from attic to basement to storage unit, never opened, never questioned. The family assumed it was old business records, maybe a farming account, maybe a general store that failed during the Depression. Nobody really asked. But one afternoon, on a grey Tuesday that shouldn't have mattered, a granddaughter named Eloise pulled it off a shelf, mostly out of curiosity, mostly because she was bored and the storage unit smelled like rain. She opened it, and she almost closed it again, because the first 50 pages looked exactly like what everyone had assumed. Columns of figures, names, dates. The kind of thing you'd find in any old business ledger. The kind of thing that means nothing to anyone a century later. But she kept going. She turned page after page, and something started to nag at her. Something small. Something she couldn't name yet. There were entries that didn't make sense. There were names that appeared again and again in a pattern she couldn't explain. And near the very end, on a page that had been folded over and tucked in on itself as if someone had tried to hide it, there was a final entry, handwritten, different ink than the rest, dated 3 days before the original owner died. Nobody in the family had ever read it. Nobody realized the final entry pointed to something worth millions. To understand why that ledger mattered, to understand why it was ignored for so long, you have to understand the family it came from. The Harlowes were not a wealthy family. They were the kind of family that worked hard and ended up with less than they started with. The kind of family that measured success not by what they built, but by what they didn't lose. They had come to Oklahoma in the early 1890s, part of the great land rush that transformed the territory. Thomas Harlowe, the patriarch, was a carpenter by trade. He built things for other people, barns, storefronts, bridges, and in his spare time, he kept meticulous records. That was the thing about Thomas. He wrote everything down, every transaction, every agreement, every dollar that passed through his hands. He kept a ledger the way some men kept a Bible, with reverence, with precision, with the kind of discipline that suggests a man who didn't trust memory. But Thomas Harlowe died in 1923, and the records he left behind meant very little to the people who inherited them. His son, Walter, was a practical man. He wasn't interested in the past. He was trying to survive the present. The 1920s were not kind to families like the Harlowes. The 1930s were worse. When the Dust Bowl came, and it came like a slow apocalypse, the sky turning brown before noon, the crops shriveling in fields that had once been green. The Harlowe family lost almost everything, the land they had farmed, the small business Thomas had helped build, the savings they had scraped together over 30 years. They left Oklahoma. They went to Kansas first, then Missouri, then finally settled in southern Illinois, where Walter found work in a coal distribution company and tried to build something again from the ground up. The ledger came with them. Nobody knows exactly why. Perhaps it was packed by accident. Perhaps Walter couldn't bring himself to throw away the last physical record of his father's life. But It made the journey, wrapped in brown paper, tucked at the bottom of a box with an old Bible and a photograph of a farmhouse that no longer existed. Over the next 40 years, the ledger changed hands 3 times. From Walter to his daughter Margaret. From Margaret to her son David. From David's estate, after he died without a clear will, to a pile of boxes that nobody fully sorted through until Eloise Harlowe came along in the autumn of 2019. By then, the family had mostly given up on the idea that anything from Oklahoma had value. The land was gone, the business was gone, the ledger was just paper. Or so they thought. Eloise was not a historian. She was a middle school science teacher from Springfield, Illinois. She'd spent her career teaching kids about photosynthesis and the periodic table. She didn't know much about land records or oil rights or early 20th century business transactions. But she knew when something didn't add up. She took the ledger home that night, spread it open on her kitchen table under a lamp, made herself a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and started reading from the beginning. The early entries were straightforward. 1897, 1898, 1899, lumber purchases, labor wages, materials for a bridge project near Guthrie. Thomas Harlowe was meticulous. Every entry dated, every amount accounted for. The handwriting was clean, precise, the kind of penmanship that used to be taught in schools. But somewhere around 1906, things changed. The entries became shorter, more cryptic. Some of the amounts were written in a different format, not dollars, but initials followed by numbers. RL 400, CPR 200, Drummond account, transfer pending. Eloise didn't know what any of that meant. She assumed it was just shorthand. Thomas had his own private accounting language, the way people sometimes do when they're keeping records only for themselves. But then there were the names. One name appeared 17 times between 1907 and 1912. Callaway. Sometimes J. Callaway. Sometimes just Callaway account. But always in the context of transactions that were larger than anything else in the ledger. Amounts in the hundreds, sometimes over $1,000, which in 1909 was not a small sum. And always, next to the Callaway entries, there was a small symbol. It looked like a stylized letter R with an extra loop at the bottom. Eloise had seen something like it before, but she couldn't place it. She photographed it and sent the image to a friend who taught history at a nearby university. The response came back the next morning. "That looks like an old notation for mineral rights registration. Where did you find this?" Eloise sat with that for a long time. Mineral rights? She didn't know much about mineral rights, but she knew enough to know they mattered, especially in Oklahoma, especially in the early 20th century, when the state was beginning to understand what was sitting beneath its soil. She kept reading. There were references to land parcels she couldn't identify, section numbers, township references, abbreviations she didn't understand. There was a recurring mention of a place called Osage Creek Junction, a name she couldn't find on any modern map. And there were transfers. In 1911 and 1912, Thomas Harlowe had recorded a series of transfers. The entries were brief, almost deliberately vague. Rights conveyed, per agreement dated April 4th. See attached. But there was nothing attached. No document, no deed, no paperwork, just the notation. And then, in 1914, the Callaway entries stopped. Completely, abruptly. No explanation, no final settlement, no closing entry. The ledger continued for another 9 years in increasingly sparse entries, smaller jobs, smaller amounts, until the final few pages where the handwriting changed. More hesitant, more labour, the entries of a man who knew he was running out of time. Eloise almost missed it the first time through. She had been focused on the Callaway entries, on the mineral rights symbol, on the mystery of why those transactions ended so abruptly. But on her third pass through the ledger, she went through it 3 times before she slept that night. She noticed something she'd overlooked. There were pages missing. Not just missing, removed. 3 pages in the middle of the ledger between what she had started calling the Callaway section and the period of quieter, smaller entries that followed. Those pages had been torn out, cleanly, carefully, close to the binding, so you almost didn't notice, but you could still see the edges if you looked. Thin strips of paper still bound into the spine where 3 full pages had once been. Eloise photographed the torn edges and sent them to her historian friend. "That's not damage," came the reply. "Those were removed intentionally. Could have been done any time. During Thomas's life, after, hard to say. But someone wanted those pages gone." The question, of course, was why? What had been on those 3 pages? The ledger's chronology gave some clues. The last intact entry before the tear was dated February 1913. The first intact entry after the tear was dated November 1913. 9 months. 9 months of records removed. Eloise started digging. She didn't know how to do archival research, but she was a science teacher. She knew how to follow evidence. She knew how to hold a hypothesis lightly and let the data lead. She ordered county records from the Oklahoma Historical Society. She reached out to the state land office. She sent letters, actual letters because some offices in rural Oklahoma still ran on paper, requesting any records connected to the name Harlowe or Callaway in the townships near Guthrie between 1905 and 1920. While she waited, she found something else in the ledger. Near the back, tucked behind the final accounting page and pressed flat against the back cover, so tightly that she'd missed it in her first 2 readings, there was a folded piece of paper. Not ledger paper, thinner, almost translucent with age. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, undated, unsigned. 2 paragraphs in a handwriting that was not Thomas's. The content was cryptic. It referred to the matter we discussed and the arrangements made in the spring. And your name should not appear in any public record. It ended with a single instruction. Keep this safe. Burn the rest. Keep this safe. Burn the rest. Someone had kept this, and Eloise could only wonder what had been burned. It took 3 months for the first records to arrive. When the packet came from the Oklahoma Historical Society, a thick manila envelope, the kind that carries weight not just in paper but in implication, Eloise sat down at her kitchen table, poured herself coffee, and opened it slowly. Inside were land registry records from Logan County, Oklahoma, dated 1907 through 1915. She almost didn't find it. The Harlowe name appeared only twice in the primary records, both times as a witness signature, not as an owner. Thomas had been careful about that. His name wasn't on the titles. But there, in a subsidiary transfer document dated March 1913, in the 9-month window of the missing ledger pages, was a transaction that connected Thomas Harlowe to something far larger than a carpenter's accounting book. The document was a transfer of mineral rights, not farm rights, not surface rights, not the ordinary rights that came with property ownership. Mineral rights, subsurface rights, the legal ownership of whatever sat beneath the ground. The parcel was listed as Section 14, Township 17 North, Range 3 West. The transferring party was listed as J. Calloway Estate, per executor order. The receiving party was listed not as Thomas Harlowe, but as a company called Meridian Land and Holding, established 1912. Eloise photographed every page and sent them to her historian friend, who by now had become something closer to a research partner. The response came within an hour. "I know what Meridian Land and Holding is. You need to call me." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. What her friend explained was this: Meridian Land and Holding had been a small, largely unknown entity, incorporated in 1912, dissolved by 1918, and mostly forgotten by the time anyone thought to look. But in the years between its founding and its dissolution, it had quietly accumulated mineral rights to over 4,000 acres of land in central Oklahoma. Land that, within a decade, would become one of the most productive oil-producing regions in the United States. Eloise asked the obvious question: who had owned Meridian Land and Holding? Her friend paused on the phone. "That's the thing," he said. "The incorporation documents list 3 founding members. One of them is J. Calloway, one is a man named Percy Drummond, and the third is listed as T.A. Harlowe. Occupation, carpenter. Address, Guthrie, Oklahoma." Thomas Harlowe had not just been a witness. He had not just been a creditor. He had been a founding member of a land-holding company that had quietly accumulated mineral rights to some of the richest oil-bearing land in the state. At exactly the moment when people were beginning to understand what Oklahoma's soil contained. And then the company dissolved. The records had disappeared. The ledger pages had been torn out. And a family that should have had a claim to something extraordinary had spent a century in a kind of ordinary grinding struggle, not knowing what had been taken from them, or what had been lost. Go back now to the ledger. Go back to that final page, the one Eloise had noticed on her first read but hadn't yet fully understood. The handwriting there is different. Thomas Harlowe was in his mid-50s when he wrote it. Old for a man of his era, one who'd worked with his hands his whole life. The letters are larger than in earlier entries, less confident. The pen had pressed deeper into the paper, as if the act of writing required more effort than it once had. The date at the top of the entry reads, October 14th, 1923. Thomas Harlowe died on October 17th, 1923. 3 days after he wrote this. The entry is not long. It takes up less than half a page. But every sentence carries weight. It begins with a notation about an outstanding account of Binti, a final sum owed to a lumber supplier in Guthrie, an amount so small it seems almost painful in context. $11.40. The concern of a man who had spent his life paying what he owed. Then, below that, a single horizontal line drawn in ink, and beneath the line, a paragraph that stands apart from everything else in the ledger, not in the columns, not in the accounting format, just words, sentences, the closest thing Thomas Harlowe ever wrote to a personal statement. The matter of Meridian and the Creek section. Rights were never fully conveyed as of the Calloway Agreement. My share, undivided 1/3 interest in mineral rights. Section 14, T17 NR3W, Logan County. Drummond has filed papers from 1913. Walter should pursue this. Do not let them say it was settled. It was not settled. Read that again. Do not let them say it was settled. It was not settled. A dying man with 3 days left to live. Writing not for himself. He had nothing left to protect, but for his son. For a future he hoped would have more than his own had given him. He had known the rights weren't settled. He had known his share had never been properly transferred or compensated. He had known that somewhere in a filing office in Logan County, Oklahoma, there was a document with his name on it, and that the land it referred to was worth more than anyone in his family understood, and he had written it down in a ledger nobody read, in a final entry nobody knew existed. For 79 years. Eloise sat with that entry for a long time. She told her historian friend she didn't sleep the night she finally understood what it said. I kept thinking about him writing that, she said later. 3 days before he died, knowing his son would probably not act on it, knowing the family was leaving Oklahoma, knowing the ledger might just sit somewhere for years. But he wrote it down anyway, because he had to, because that was who he was. The man who kept a ledger the way some men kept a Bible. He'd kept it until the very end. What happened next was not simple. These stories never are. Eloise hired an attorney, a property law specialist from Tulsa who had spent 30 years working on Oklahoma mineral rights cases. A niche practice, but not an uncommon one. The state had a long history of disputed claims, lost rights, and families who hadn't known what they owned until someone else was already extracting it. The attorney spent 4 months tracing the chain of title on Section 14, T17 NR3W. What he found was complicated and infuriating and, in the cold language of legal analysis, potentially actionable. The land in question had changed hands multiple times since 1913. The mineral rights had been separated from the surface rights in the 1920s, a common practice, and then traded, bundled and transferred through a series of holding companies over the following decades. By the 1940s, the mineral rights to the section had been acquired by a regional oil and gas company that would later be absorbed into one of the mid-century energy giants. The wells drilled on that section and on the adjacent sections whose rights had been aggregated along with it had produced oil for over 60 years. The current estimated value of the undeveloped mineral rights remaining on that land, factoring in current reserves and commodity pricing, not the value of oil already extracted over 6 decades, but just the remaining rights, was assessed by an independent geological firm at somewhere between $30 and $50 million for a 1/3 undivided interest. Thomas Harlowe's documented share. You do the math. But the legal picture was not straightforward. There is a principle in property law called adverse possession. There are statutes of limitations on mineral rights claims. There are questions about whether a ledger entry constitutes a legally enforceable claim, and whether the documented destruction of related records, those torn-out pages, constitutes evidence of fraud, or simply the private choices of a man who is a century dead. The case, as of the time this script was written, is ongoing. The Harlowe family, Eloise, her 2 siblings and several cousins, filed suit in Logan County District Court. The defendant is a holding company that currently controls the mineral rights through a chain of title that the Harlowe attorneys argue is tainted by the original failure to properly convey Thomas's share. The case attracted attention. A legal journal ran a piece on it as an example of the enduring complexity of early Oklahoma land rights. A documentary team reached out to Eloise within 3 weeks of the story appearing in regional news. At least 2 other families in Oklahoma reached out to say they believed they had similar situations, that they, too, had records suggesting rights that were never properly settled. Eloise was not prepared for any of that. She is a science teacher from Springfield, Illinois. She opened an old ledger on a grey Tuesday because she was bored in a storage unit. She did not expect to spend the next 2 years in communication with lawyers, historians, documentary filmmakers, and distant relatives she had never met. All because a man who died in 1923 had pressed a pen into paper 3 days before the end and written down what he knew, what he hoped his family would one day understand. There is a version of this story that ends with numbers, with settlement amounts and court decisions and headlines about a family that recovered what should have been theirs for a century. Maybe that version will be told someday. But this is not that story. This story is about what gets lost, not in court, not through legal maneuver or corporate absorption or the long, grinding machinery of commerce, lost in the quieter way, the way a ledger sits in a box for 40 years because nobody thinks it matters, the way a family scatters after a hard decade and leaves the past behind them because the past feels like failure, the way a man writes down the most important thing he knows 3 days before he dies and trusts that someone, someday, will read it. Think about how many Thomas Harlowes there are. Not one, not a dozen. Thousands. People who kept careful records of things the world later decided weren't important. People who understood the value of what they had in eras when the powerful moved quickly and the careful were left holding paper instead of land. People whose documentation, whose proof, sat in boxes and attics and storage units and estate sales and archive shelves, waiting for someone with enough curiosity and enough patience to ask the right questions. The history of land in America, of resources in America, is largely a history of who was paying attention at the right moment, and who wasn't. The families who understood what oil meant in 1910 built dynasties. The families who didn't, who were carpenters, who were farmers, who were focused on surviving the present, sometimes found out too late, or never found out at all. Eloise Harlowe found out because she didn't close the ledger, because she let the strangeness of those entries nag at her instead of dismissing it, because she spent a night at her kitchen table with cold coffee and a lamp, turning pages that most people would have set aside. Thomas Harlowe's final entry is 19 lines long. It took him, based on the evidence of the handwriting, the effort visible in each letter, probably 30 minutes to write. 30 minutes. For a man with 3 days left to live, that was not nothing. He had kept records his whole life. He kept them at the end. He pressed the pen into the paper and wrote down what was true. Not because he was certain anyone would act on it, not because he believed his son would have the resources or the knowledge to pursue it, but because he was Thomas Harlowe. And Thomas Harlowe wrote things down. There are ledgers in boxes all over this country, in storage units and estate sales, in attics that smell like rain, in archive rooms that run on paper and underfunding, and the labor of people who believe that records matter. Some of them contain nothing. Most of them contain nothing. But some of them have a final entry. A last careful line of ink pressed in by the hand of someone who didn't want what they knew to disappear entirely. Someone who trusted in the specific and fragile way of people who keep records that the truth written down is harder to erase than the truth merely spoken. The question is whether anyone will read it. Eloise Harlowe read it 96 years after her great-grandfather's hand wrote the final line. On a grey Tuesday, in a storage unit that smelled like rain. She almost didn't. If you found this story powerful, share it. Subscribe for more hidden histories. And if you have a ledger, an old document, a box of records that nobody's looked at, look at it. You may not know what you're holding,